this is Mr. Coates, and this is APES lecture number 37 on meat production. This whole series has been on agriculture, and here we've already talked a little bit about aquaculture, and so I'm going to just concentrate on terrestrial meat production. This is what we call a feedlot. This is a commercial feedlot here in the United States, and these cows are milking cows here, and so they basically feed them all kinds of different food and food additives in these troughs. They fatten them up and get them to produce the most milk as possible in a short amount of time. You can see this place is huge. It's acres and acres. So there's a lot of problems with meat production because this is the way that most of our meat is produced, and it doesn't matter if we're talking about chickens or pigs or whatever in this country. So this is what we call industrial meat production. Meat sources. Where do we get our meat from? 90% of all meat and milk products in the world are eaten by the United States, Europe, and Japan. And that's only about 20% of the world's population. So we are the carnivores. People in developing countries really don't eat that much meat, and the meat they do eat is usually not that healthy. It's usually what we call bush meat, which is just meat they find out and around in the jungles and so forth. It could be monkeys, it could be lizards, it could be snakes. Sometimes, unfortunately, it's animals that are endangered, like gorillas. Now, we mentioned earlier that grain here in the United States, we grow a lot of grain in the United States just for feeding meat, and this is a very wasteful practice. 90% of the grain in the United States is mostly used for animal feed, and that's not just cows and horses and pigs and what have you. That also goes into feeding like cats and dogs. So if you ever look at the ingredients to your cat food and your dog food, there's a lot of different grains in that. We produce a lot of grain out there, a lot of crops, just to feed to animals so we can eat those animals or we can have those animals around. And once again, it's not very efficient. 16 kilograms of grain will give you 1 kilogram of meat, and remember, that's because of that rule of 10. And so it's very inefficient to eat meat all the time. Alright, if you ate grain instead, you'd get 20 times the calories and 8 times the protein per grain by weight if you ate that instead of eating meat. And you can get proteins by eating other plants too, like beans, for example. Meat's not necessarily the best type of food for us to be feeding a bunch of grains to. We could feed a lot more people with these grains than we can with this meat. So what's the future of meat? Basically, as I said, here in the United States, industrial agriculture is based on feedlots. This is a chicken one right here, and you just have chickens on top of chickens on top of chickens that eat grains and get fattened up before they go to harvest. And so these are called feedlots. And they basically feed exclusively grains. They also feed a lot of antibiotics to these animals, a lot of hormones to these animals, and a lot of people have problems with eating these. And so there's a huge drive in this country right now to eat free-range meat. And free-range meat is meat that doesn't grow up in a situation like this. They grow up out in a field where you think the cows grow up, and they only eat natural grasses and grains and things like that. They don't get any hormones. So you can see a lot of our beef and our pork and our poultry is all raised just like this. And it's unfortunate. There's a lot of problems with this. There's a lot of wastes. We've talked about how nitrogenous waste coming from these animals can cause eutrophication in the nearest water body. So what do you do with these wastes? Well, sometimes you can turn them into fuel. We saw that in the video already. The problem is a lot of times these create really bad fumes. If you've ever been driving through Texas and all of a sudden you just get this terrible whiff of manure, you can basically bet that you are close, within 5 miles of a major feedlot. And these things can stink for a long distance. So that's a problem. Also, a lot of these places release lots of methane. Methane's a greenhouse gas, and so this contributes to the greenhouse effect. So that's a big problem. And then just the general care of the animals. I mean, how well can you care for the well-being of animals that are packed into a structure like this so tightly that you can't even observe each one of them every single day? And so PETA is all up in arms in this, obviously, as well as some of the other animal cruelty organizations out there. Unfortunately, most of our meat comes from a situation like this, and it's very hard to find meat out there that doesn't in the United States. There are some limits to food production. We're not going to be able to raise all the meat all the time. I mean, right now we're at our limit of arable land, and we cannot plant any more land on this planet. It's basically all been planted. Precipitation also limits our amount of food on this planet. If we want to raise more meat, that means we're going to have to grow more grains, and we don't have the rainfall on the planet to support any more crops, nor do we have the land. And then temperature is becoming a big problem because of climate change. We're starting to see some of those ranges where crops can grow are actually creeping away from where they normally would be. They might be creeping more further north in the northern hemisphere or further south in the southern hemisphere. And you might get to places that can't support those crops anymore because they don't have the right soil type or the right precipitation or anything like that. So we might be forcing crops to migrate into areas that they aren't that good at growing in. So how can we increase our food supply overall? We've tried to use irrigation, using drip irrigation, which is more efficient than regular irrigation. When we get to water resources, we'll talk about irrigation issues. But utilizing of water more efficiently is one way we can do that. If we grow crops in more arid regions and we use very efficient irrigation, we can actually increase our arable land. We're not going to be able to increase it that much, and this is a very difficult thing to do, is to increase that amount of arable land. The other thing we can start doing is that we can start eating lower on the food chain, so we could eat more plant material, get more of our proteins from plant material rather than eating meat. Stop using other types of grains to grow meat and use those grains for human food. So that's one thing we can do. Insects. This is already happening in a lot of developing countries where protein is very limited, and so they are farming insects now. And I know eating insects is not very appealing, but they have a lot of protein in them. And if you think about a lot of these insects, especially like scorpions down here and some other ones, they basically are nothing more than land type crabs. And if prepared right, they might be very tasty. Now, I've never eaten a worm like this or a scorpion. I've eaten some other bugs before. But it definitely would take some time for American culture to eat insects. But it might have to happen if we can't raise the amount of meat that we need in order to get our proteins. And once again, all these insects can be raised in captivity in great quantities and don't have to be fed grains and things like that to get them to marketable size. So we could modify our food distribution systems. I mentioned back in our malnourishment lecture that it's not that we don't have enough food, it's that we don't have the right distribution systems for the food. It's hard to get food to all those people. So if we can modify our distribution systems, maybe get more efficient at distributing food, then that will help increase our food supply. Also waste. We waste a lot of food. If we would basically buy some of the food with blemishes like apples and things like that that might have a dark spot on them and use the part that's not damaged, we could definitely increase our food supply there. But Americans are very particular about what their food looks like, and we don't buy things that have dark spots on them or brown spots or anything like that, even though most of the item might be still good. So one of the best solutions here is those people who have food problems is teach locals how to best utilize their land, the land they have around them, and with appropriate technology, and so they can support themselves and they don't have to get food from some other place. So we get rid of this whole distribution problem. And that's happening a little bit here in the United States now. You're starting to see local farms pop up, and here close to where we live, we have a pretty large local farm, and you can go there and you can buy vegetables. They're a little bit more expensive, but they're healthier for you, and not as much energy went into growing them and getting them to market because you go and pick them right out of the field. And so it's a great way to increase our food supply. You could grow your own garden. In fact, I have a garden in my backyard where I grow tomatoes and some lettuce and some other things that we eat here in my house. And so that helps me save money, but it also increases our food supply. Well, that's all I have to say about agriculture. I hope you have learned something about food, and maybe you ever get a chance to try maybe eating an insect. They may not be as bad as you think.